the wake of the Supreme Court's bombshell opinion on Roe v. Wade, a new CBS YouGov poll taken over the weekend shows an overwhelming majority of Americans disapprove of overturning Roe, and even more women disapprove.
The moment has turned into campaign fodder for politicians, as Democrats, particularly those facing tough re-elections in the midterms, are wasting no time trying to capitalize on the Supreme Court's consequential decision.
The top Democrat, Joe Biden, did as well. Apparently his campaign used the moment to ask for $15 donations. Here was one person's reaction to that.
My rights should not be a fundraising point for them or a campaigning point. They have had multiple opportunities to codify Roe into law over the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and they haven't done it. And if they're going to keep campaigning on this point, they should actually do something about it.
Joining us now to discuss is the executive director of the Women's March, Rachel O'Leary Carmona, and associate editor at Reason Magazine, Liz Wolfe. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, so, Rachel, what do you make of this kind of fundraising on the issue going on among Democrats? I mean, I would think, well, obviously they're going to fundraise on it. This is kind of a lifeline to the Democrats at the moment. With the expectation that November was going to be a bloodbath for them. Here's an issue that does seem to motivate, not just a lot of their base, but theoretically at least some, moderate voters or voters who are disaffected with Democrats for whatever reason, but aren't fully socially conservative and whatnot. But then is there a not tactful way, I guess, to approach this for Democrats? Give us your thoughts.
I mean, I think the issue is complicated, but I will say that one of the challenges around Roe versus Wade, and one of the challenges about other issues that have become tough or intractable for the country, is that we've got an opposition in the Republicans who are pushing an increasingly unpopular agenda that can't win on its merits. And so they have to win by packing courts or suppressing voters or any of the ways that they're moving. And that's real. And then we've got the Democrats who are not fighting that as hard as they need to. And I think moving forward, what you're hearing is a shift in the movement in that we're not really going to distinguish between the two anymore. So I think that there is truth to that. And that said, a lot of what has to happen in order to create the conditions for social change is very unsexy organizing. And some of that includes raising money. And so I think that there is a critique there about folks who have done, not enough on the issue raising money. But I also think we need to be careful to not fall into the trap to think that fundraising or doing organizing work that isn't necessarily, the sexiest thing or the most glamorous thing isn't what gets the goods. So I think we have to have a nuanced take.
Right. But I think some people might find that the sexy and unglamorous, organizing is not, in fact, being done by the Democrats, which I think you allude to, right? It's like, it's not the problem is that they need money. It's that the money needs to happen in order to campaign on things or to fundraise. I think the problem is that we recognize Democrats have not been fighting this. They kind of sit idly by. In fact, they were actually very dismissive and derogatory towards people who are actually warning of this exact issue that we're in right now for years. So I think that might be, why people have this issue with, okay, on the heels of this, you immediately send out template emails that were already ready, like, give us $15, chip in, and we can do this. Oh, well, why didn't you do it in all this period of time you have? What do you say to that, Liz?
Well, I think we've seen a really, really interesting divergence lately. In public opinion, it used to be pretty evenly split in this country between pro-life and pro-choice identification. We used to have about, per Gallup and Pew polling, 47% of Americans identified as pro-life, 49% identified as pro-choice. Now, in the last few months especially, we've seen those numbers really diverge to the point where only 40% of Americans share my pro-life convictions, and about 55% of people identify as pro-choice. Overturning Roe is actually extremely unpopular. So it's interesting because the way I look at this is we've had the pro-life legal movement and judges that have been pushed through and sculpted and molded by the Federalist Society. We've seen conservatives be astonishingly successful at getting them into federal court positions and especially on the Supreme Court. I mean, one way this could have been prevented was if Ruth Bader Ginsburg had stepped down a little bit, in advance in a way that would have been secure and allowed a Democratic president to be the one who, appointed the next justice. But she didn't do that. And I think a lot of commentators on the left have pointed that out very rightly. There hasn't been some sort of untoward court packing type thing happening on the Supreme Court. What we've seen instead is the fact that Amy Coney Barrett was confirmed, the fact that Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed. Federalist Society has been astonishingly successful at this. But then on the pro-choice side, they've been astonishingly successful at the marketing thing. You know, we shroud all of this in the language of reproductive rights and reproductive justice. And we so infrequently in our country actually talk about the stages of fetal development, our scientific understanding of this, how our understanding of viability has actually changed as we have more and more scientific advancement. And we rarely talk about what the actual abortion procedures are that are being performed. So I would say both sides have an obvious blind spot and both sides have an obvious strength.
You know, I think you make a great point, actually, Liz, when you say that previously we were pretty evenly split down the middle when it came to pro-life, pro-choice, but that has changed in these months. And I think that speaks to, what do you think about the idea that the country, or maybe even just Democrats' voter base, is changing faster than the party itself is, right? And the party is not adjusting fast enough to the demands and the changing viewpoints of the party. Rachel, what do you think?
I mean, I think that's spot on. I think, and I also think a couple of things. I mean, the first is that I think that's right. I think that historically the people have moved the party and not the opposite way. And so I think that it's actually pretty historical. And I think the second piece is that it's a little easier to be ideological when the stakes are not that you're about to have your rights rolled back. So many of us grew up in a landscape. I'm from Wisconsin. I've lived in a lot of blue states where, you know, what folks would tell you is this is a right that will never be taken away from you. They don't take rights away from you.
Right.
And so when you then are faced with a reality where there's an actual and real rollback of rights, I think the rubber hits a road in a different way. And you have to really contend with and grapple with the issue that might be easier to kind of have an opinion about that doesn't ever feel like it has stakes, personal stakes for you. And I think that we'll see those numbers continue to diverge, you know, as the reality of our post-Roe world, you know, really sets in.
That's true. To be fair, I did see a lot of people that, you know, even people who voted for Trump in 2016 or people who identify as Republicans, very, very against this overturning of Roe. And I think both are speaking to something that is very fair, right? We've never had a constitutional right taken away, even though, like I said, there have always been advocates and people on the left warning of the moment that we're in. I think it's easy to say if something's never happened in the entire history, you know what I mean, of the country, and certainly not in your lifetime, it's fair to think, oh, that wouldn't happen now. So I think, you know, that's why we're seeing this kind of broad, people are not happy with this decision.
I'm certainly picking up on a lot of Democratic fatalism. The conservatives I know are, you know, they're having a good time right now. They're feeling like there's been a lot of wins or a lot of pushback for them. Their landscape for 2022 and in truth 2024 looks pretty good. Whereas the Democrats I know are just like their world is coming to an end, which I don't know can theoretically have. A lot of Democrats I know are so over it. They're not like, and we need to go to the polls and fix things. They're very like, I don't want to participate in the system anymore. I want to like break my toys and go home.
People didn't want to hear me, right? Weeks ago, I said Democrats need to start listening to the left. I said that the voter base is far more liberal than what they make it out to be in this kind of moderate centrist, and people are becoming disillusioned with the Democrats. And I think what you're seeing now is, even though, right, people who feel the Republicans are this, and I'm, you know, definitely on the side of I think this is bigotry, I think this is wrong, I at least concede Republicans serve their base. That's what I've maintained. And I think a lot of people are seeing and feeling frustrated now with, okay, vote blue, I vote blue. I support the Democrats. These are who I need to support in order to fight the Republicans, but they don't fight. They don't fight.
Well,
look at Liz.
There's also the other way around this, which is like, instead of doing the team red, team blue thing, which I find to be absolutely miserable, obviously,
right.
The thing that we could do, or that we could have done, and I think now it's too late, the toothpaste is out of the tube and you can't stuff it back in. The thing that we could have done is settled on more moderate abortion laws from the get-go. And I think those wouldn't have fully satisfied the pro-life side. If you're somebody who believes, like I do, that life begins at conception, you know, allowing abortion at 12 weeks isn't really something that's permissible. But still, you could have attempted to go after some sort of consensus approach like what Europe does. You know, Italy and France and Germany, a whole bunch of Scandinavian countries, pretty much all of Western Europe, you know, allows abortion up until week 12, in some rare cases up until week 14 in some countries. But generally speaking, that's their rough consensus. That's what they allow there. And yet in the US, we have states like in Virginia, you can get an abortion up until 25 weeks. I'm 25 weeks pregnant right now. I'm like huge. You can't see it on screen. You know, in New York, you can get an abortion at week 24. In most blue states, in Illinois, in most blue states, you can get abortions at 24 and 25 weeks. And so what we've seen happen is we've seen pro-lifers advocate for total bans. And then we've seen a lot of pro-choicers and a lot of people in blue states advocate for allowing abortion up until a very late stage, up until the end of the second trimester, which I think is something that, per public opinion polling, you know, most people don't support that. They feel viscerally, morally uncomfortable with that. So something we could have done many years ago is pursue a little bit more of a sensible, safe, legal, rare type framework, which was sort of the thing that we were focused on back a long time ago. And for whatever reason, we've really abandoned that.
So I think that's a
I think we also need to talk about the facts that 91% of abortions happen in the first trimester. And so when we talk about like I'm curious about who we is in this situation, because I think that when we're talking about this, we are talking about that. And then I also think that most people thought this was settled law. And and even the Supreme Court, you mentioned that there was no court packing, which I disagree with. At least one of those seats was outright stolen. And then other two were put in very irregular confirmation processes. And in those processes, those justices said, we will not overturn Roe. We think that this is a settled law. So I think that it's really difficult because the majority of the people have spoken and continue to speak. And we are talking about creating a law that actually does not meet in the middle. It is not a consensus. It's not something that everyone agrees with. Even folks on the red side of the aisle, if that's how you're talking about it, don't agree with this. And so I really think that we need to be careful in the way that we're talking about this, because we even in this conversation, we're spinning a narrative that isn't rooted in the public opinion and the way that folks are thinking about this on the ground.
Right. Well, the Supreme Court isn't a majoritarian institution, and I think it's worth noting that this is ultimately a federalist solution. What this does is returns the issues to the states and allows my state, Texas, to go from its former 6-week gestational age ban to now within the next, I think, 26 days or something. Now it will be fully outlawed. And it allows my other state that I live in, New York, to continue to have extremely permissive abortion laws that ban abortions after 24 weeks. So, I mean, in terms of what this actually does, yes, it's not something that reflects the majority will of the people, which isn't necessarily something that we ask the Supreme Court to do. We can talk about whether that's implicitly what we want from them, but it's not a majoritarian institution. And ultimately, this is a federalist decision that returns this issue to the states. So that is slightly more local decision making, even if it's still impermissible. And even if people still aren't fully happy with that.
Okay, but we say the Supreme Court.
But I would say Texas is also my home state. And what I would say about that is that you cannot contend with abortion that goes back to the states while at the same time having over 30 pieces of legislation just in the last, 18 months alone that also aim at restricting voter, access. And so you can't say that it's going back to the states and also make a serious argument to say that the folks in the states are fully empowered to speak on the issue when we know that significant voter suppression and gerrymandering has happened, particularly in red states.
And I'm glad that we brought up the bans, right? Liz, you brought up the bans because I think that's an important point in responding to your initial proposal, right? A moderate proposal, a world where we come to a compromise in between, works with people that are willing to compromise or are interested in a moderate proposal. Here we see Republicans are not interested in meeting in the middle or, incorporating the views of everybody else. What they want is a ban, and that's what they're in the business of doing. We already see at least 26 states are suspected to engage in some level of a ban. And in response to the earlier point about the Supreme Court is not there to make sure they're doing what's in majoritarian rule. But I'll say this, it does matter when you talk about evaluating the sincerity of a position. If we're arguing, states' rights, it's about, returning to the will of the people, but you're recognizing that they're not interested in what the people want or the majority of the people support, and they're going to put bans in place. It is, in fact, not about the will of the people. So I do think that needs to be evaluated in that argument.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, apparently, but thank you both, Liz and Rachel, for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
And we'll be back with more Rising right after this.